Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Annie, and thanks for heading up our efforts to like do a big blitz of forays and stuff that weekend. I think it'll be fun. So next up, we've got Megan to talk about Robigalia.
All right. All right, can you see it?
I see it.
All right. Hi, everyone. We're talking about Robigalia because it's April and Robigalia happens in April. And I wasn't entirely sure what I'd told Tom I was going to talk about back when he and I talked about it, but we'll see how this goes. It sort of morphed after a while because talking about just Robigalia, there's not a whole lot there. But I wanted to expand it to talk about the reason for Robigalia, which is wheat rust. And a few times ago, we had Zachary Mazie talk to us about mushroom cookbooks and sort of the lack of diversity of mushrooms in mushroom cookbooks. And he was also at the end talking about sort of microfungi that we eat, Aspergillus oryzae associated with soy, penicillium and cheese, and some of those things. And the fact of the matter is that you're probably eating mushroom spores a whole lot more than you know. So even if you don't think you're into mycophagy, you are eating mushrooms. You are eating fungi because the spores are everywhere and they're tiny. And if you go out and pick a tomato in your garden, you're eating fungi. So in addition to being something that we eat, fungi also compete for what we eat. So Robigalia was one way that ancient Romans dealt with the fungi that compete for what we eat. All right. So around this time of year, this is what our basement looks like. We've got seedlings of peppers and tomatoes and basil and all these other things. And they're growing and they're lush and they're green. And we remember every year what the garden looks like because it's full of green, happy plants. And then sometime around late July, August, this is what the garden starts to look like. You've got the powdery mildew on the cucurbits, you've got anthracnose on your peppers, your tomatoes are all wilting. So the fungi move in and they take over and they're eating everything and kind of taken away from you. And every year I'm grateful that I'm not relying on our garden to feed us because we'd be doomed. There's no way we would survive if that was it. And you think about so many places in the world that do rely on what's being grown and times throughout history when you had to rely on what you could grow on your land. And no wonder that in ancient Rome, all of April was dedicated to various agricultural fests. So on April 1st, you had Veneralia, which was for Venus. That's also the root of venereal disease, of course. And that's now celebrated as April Fool's Day. In early April, you had Cerealia in honor of Ceres, the goddess of wheat. April 15th, you had Forticidia, dedicated to herd fertility, especially cows. April 21st, Perilia, dedicated to sheep and shepherds. April 23rd, the first Venalia. There was a second one later on in the season, but you had the first one in April. And in April 27th, you had Floralia, dedicated to the goddess of flowers. And I think it's pretty remarkable that on April 25th, you had Robigalia, which was dedicated to one fungus. You could say that Venalia is also dedicated to a fungus since it's wine, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast is what's behind wine. So there are really two festivals for fungi, but this one, instead of being all about just wheat or diseases or plant diseases, it was one single fungus that they had this entire festival to celebrate, to try to keep the stem rust away from their wheat. So what is stem rust? So wheat stem rust is Puccinia graminis forma specialis triticale. Puccinia is a genus of rust, graminis for grain, and triticale for triticum or wheat. And wheat rust is a basidiomycete. It's in the phylum Basidiomycota, like mushrooms, like most of the mushrooms, not morels, but most of the mushrooms that we're hunting and eating are in the Basidiomycota because they produce basidia spores on basidia. And that is an evolved character that characterizes the Basidium mycota. So rusts have this crazy life cycle. They often have 2 different hosts. They have up to 4 different spore types. In this case, you have this first spore type, the spermatium, making spermatia, which are the spores. So you have Matagonia making spermatia. They land and they grow and they form an Isidium, which has these esiospores. And so in this case, the host that makes the esiospores and the esia is Berberis, which is the common barberry. So you can see all these esiospores here. The esiospores then jump onto a different host, and on wheat, they form Uridinia and Uridinia spores. And then towards the end of the summer, they make these sort of resting spores, teliospores, from which the basidia and the basidiaspores are produced. So wheat rust is pretty impressive when it infects wheat. The stem rust can really decimate wheat. And if you put some of this under the microscope, these are the teliospores of Puccinia, and Puccinia graminis in this case. So people knew about this association early on. You could see that if you had a lot of barberry that was infected near your wheat, then you got wheat rust. So without even being able to see it under the microscope and only seeing this red rusty powder, this connection was sort of known. So one way to prevent getting wheat rust on your wheat is to kill the barberry. So if you block your source of inoculum, kind of like with COVID, if you wear your mask, if you're socially distanced, if you keep the inoculum away, then you'll have less wheat rust. So the earliest that we know about that was in 1660 in Rennes, France. There was the first known attempt at barberry eradication to avoid wheat rust. In the US, we started barberry eradication in 1918 and finally phased it out by 1990. So that lasted a long time. So people living in all of these states in northern US were encouraged to go out, find any barberry bushes, especially Japanese barberry, but any barberry bushes that were growing, and get rid of them. And to this day, you cannot sell susceptible barberry to any of these states. It's illegal because we don't want to be building up the inoculum that's going to affect the wheat. So when this first started in the early 1900s, there was a big campaign and there were all these posters about going out and getting the barberry, and they even started to get kids involved. So there was the National Rust Busters Club. You could go and find barberry for other people to dig up. And when you did that, you got this medal. And apparently that was, something to do. So they got all of these kids in 4-H and scouts involved, had them going out and looking for barberry. Here's a young girl with her medal, proud of finding her barberry bush. And that sort of worked. So these were percent losses of wheat stem rust epidemics over time. So in 1918, when they started eradicating barberry or trying to eradicate barberry, the epidemics, which are here in the blue bars, did start to go down. And so by 1932, you were losing about 2%, 1% of the wheat yield per year. And then something happened in 1935. So they were trying to get rid of all the barberry bushes. But obviously it didn't work so well, because by 1935, you had about 25% loss of wheat yield due to stem rust. So in that year, the wheat yield in North Dakota, in Minnesota, was actually halved. And it was really decimated in a whole lot of other states. So even though we were trying to get rid of the inoculum, trying to get rid of the barberry, stem rust was still out there reproducing and causing major destruction. So the other option besides getting rid of an alternate host is to breed for resistance. And of course, back then, the only option really was conventional breeding. So you would put together 2 varieties, something that had all the traits that you wanted with something that had disease resistance, do several cycles of back crosses, took about 8 to 10 years, and you would finally get a variety with some disease resistance. So this slide has a lot on it, and I'm going to explain what's going on here. But in 1935, what happened was you had a race of stem rust that was able to overcome the resistance genes. So they'd been breeding wheat and had varieties Ceres, named after the goddess of wheat, and Triumph. And those varieties contained these SR genes, stem rust resistant genes. And that also worked pretty well. And that was part of why we weren't seeing much stem rust. But along came race 56, and this is like the Omicron variant or the Delta variant. So this was a mutation in the pathogen that was able to overcome any sort of breeding, any sort of vaccination attempts, inoculation attempts, and cause some major damage to the crop. So more breeding happened, more stem rust resistant genes were identified, and the epidemic sort of went down again. And by 1961, there was really a global push to do a lot of wheat breeding, and a lot of resistance genes were put into the varieties that were out there. And from about 1961 on, you really saw very, very little stem rust. So things were great. We were growing wheat, getting all sorts of wheat out there, not seeing major epidemics of stem rust. And then along came, so we weren't seeing major epidemics of stem rust, and wheat production just kept going up. And globally, wheat is actually the most consumed grain. Rice is second, and it is very important, but wheat is the most consumed grain in diets across the world. Corn is more produced. There is more corn production, but most of that goes to feed and ethanol. So wheat is really the most important grain in terms of consumption around the world, and rice is second. So you had this situation where a lot of wheat was getting grown, doing well, rust epidemics weren't decimating it, and then along came 1998. And in Uganda, you had another rise of a race called UG99. And again, this is like ultra Omicron. So the pathogen, the rust, evolved, mutated, and was able to overcome all of the resistance genes that people had put into different lines of wheat. And so this field is not brown because the wheat's ready to get harvested. It's brown because it's dead and the wheat heads are completely empty. And it just really decimates crops. Since 1999, various races, and again, you could think of these like variants, Delta, Omicron, Alpha, Beta, various races have spread throughout Africa and into the Middle East. And they are all lineages of UG99 and things that are related. And UG99 hasn't arrived in the US yet, but we are concerned about it. So the Cereal Disease Lab in St. Paul, Minnesota is doing quite a bit of breeding and a lot of research into the biology of the pathogen, into wheat biology. And they were able to come up with a UG99 resistant variety called Linkert. And about 1 million acres are being grown right now of this UG99 resistant wheat variety. But because pathogens evolve and we aren't always able to keep up, this is going to keep happening. And wheat rust is now back in Europe as of 2016 in Italy. So that brings us back to Italy. So a new variety of stem rust devastated the Sicilian crops, and these races with their designations, they're finding more and more that are overcoming any sort of resistance. So it's no wonder that all of April in ancient Rome was spent on these agricultural festivals, and they were kind of onto something. So Robigalia, if you don't have microscopes and you don't have conventional breeding and this red scourge comes into your wheat every year, then you've got some options and you see how they work for you. So Numa Pompilius, that name there, was the second king of Rome. His real existence is debatable, but apparently instituted by him. The Robigalia was celebrated in honor of Robigo or Robigus. We don't know if Robigo was a god or a goddess, and I kind of think of it as both. The goddess of red rust was celebrated on April 25th when the crops were most vulnerable to disease. In his poem for that day, Ovid relates that he himself happened to meet the priest as he and his followers, all dressed in white, were on their way to the sacred grove to offer sacrifice. Joining the procession, he relates how the Flamen Quirinalis, which was a priest, carried with him the entrails of both a dog and a sheep. And according to what you read about it, one of the sacrifices was red dogs or red puppies, with the red color meant to symbolize the red of the rust. So it was this sort of like homeopathic kind of medicine, I guess, for the plants. Incense, wine, and entrails were thrown onto the fire and a prayer offered. Scaly Robigo, god of rust, spare Ceres' brain. Let silky blades quiver on the soil skin. Let growing crops be nourished by a friendly sky and stars until they ripen for the sieve. Spare us, I pray, keep Scabrous hands from the harvest. Harm no crops. The power to harm is enough. And I put that in there just for the information, but also because I think that last sentence is pretty profound. That the power to harm should be enough when you're thinking of harming. And you might want to double think about the actual harm. So Robigalia, as far as I can tell in reading, was just a day. There were feasting, probably eating some bread, drinking some wine, enjoying that particular fungus. There were games, chariot races, big chariot races, small chariot races, the dog sacrifice. And the first I heard about Robigalia was as a plant pathology graduate student. So one of the other students convinced us to celebrate Robigalia. So we dressed up in togas and we made a red paper mache dog, which we then burned in a bonfire. We didn't have a little red dachshund. This is another plant pathology department and their Robigalia. This is what plant pathology graduate students do for fun on their weekends. So this is what was done during Robigalia. So for all of you out there, this April 25th, if you like wheat, even if you don't, wear a toga if you like, symbolically make a sacrifice, eat some bread, and maybe raise a toast, thank you to yeast, to the ancient Roman attempts to tame the fungus that threatened their wheat, and be grateful that we have better tools now. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Megan. That's awesome. I will turn it over now to Mitch to show us some of the pictures people have sent in this month.
Cool. Hey, everybody. Thanks, Megan. That was really cool. Okay. Hope that worked. Everybody see that all right?
Yep, looks good.